The tension in the aisles. The sun beat down relentlessly through the dusty windows of Mr. Paxton's grocery store, casting long shadows on the wooden floors. The heat inside was stifling, the air thick with the smell of aging produce and cleaning chemicals. Every inch of space seemed to be weighed down by the tension that clung to the walls, simmering in the oppressive summer heat. The flickering hum of the overhead fluorescent lights added to the discomfort, and it felt as though even the walls were closing in on Marcus. Marcus wiped a bead of sweat from his brow as he carefully arranged cans on the shelf, trying his best to ignore the discomfort of the day. He was used to the heat by now, used to the monotony of working long hours at the small grocery store. Paxton's Grocery, as it was called, was the only place that would hire him in the small town. It wasn't much, certainly not the kind of job that Marcus had dreamed of when he was younger, but it paid the bills. And in a town where jobs were scarce, and opportunities even scarcer, it was more than enough to keep his younger siblings fed and sheltered. Marcus' family had faced more than its fair share of hardships over the years. His father had passed away when Marcus was just a teenager, and his mother, who had always struggled with her health, had been bedridden for as long as he could remember. At the age of 24, Marcus had found himself in charge of a household filled with responsibilities far beyond his years. His younger siblings, 6 of them, ranging from 3 to 16, depended on him completely. And the weight of that responsibility, though it had once been a source of pride, had begun to feel suffocating. But today, the weight of that responsibility wasn't the only thing pressing down on him. There was something more, something unspoken. It was in the way the store's customers avoided eye contact, in the way the air felt thicker than usual. It was in the sharp tone of Mr. Paxton's voice as he barked orders from behind the counter, a voice that carried an underlying menace that Marcus couldn't ignore. Mr. Paxton was a large, imposing man with a presence that could suck the life out of any room. His face was often red, his cheeks puffy from years of drinking, and his eyes sharp like a hawk's, always watching, always scrutinizing. He had a reputation in the town for being quick to anger, and there were rumors that he had once gotten into trouble with the law over his temper. But that didn't matter to Marcus. What mattered was that he needed this job. And that thought alone kept him from standing up to Paxton, no matter how cruel or unfair the man's behavior became. The bell above the door chimed, a sound that made Marcus flinch. He looked up to see Mr. Paul slowly making his way into the store. Mr. Paul was an elderly man, his frail frame almost bent in two with age. He always came in at the same time every week, shuffling slowly down the aisles with the help of his cane. There was something dignified about him, even though his age and disability had taken their toll on him. Mr. Paul had lived in the town for as long as Marcus could remember, and though he didn't speak much, he was well liked by everyone who knew him. But Marcus could already feel the shift in the atmosphere when Mr. Paul entered. Paxton's eyes, usually half-lidded with a kind of indifference, suddenly narrowed, and the harshness in his voice seemed to grow. "What do you want, you old fool?" Paxton's voice rang out, loud and harsh, filling the otherwise quiet store. He didn't even bother to look up from his magazine as he spoke, his words dripping with disdain. Mr. Paul, who had been carefully inspecting the cans on the shelf, didn't react to the words at first. He merely continued to examine the labels, his wrinkled fingers trembling slightly as he reached for a tin of beans. But Marcus saw it in the way Mr. Paul's shoulders stiffened, a quiet recognition that the old man had been through far too many confrontations like this one. Yet, despite the barrage of insults that Paxton had flung his way over the years, Mr. Paul always held his head high. It was something Marcus admired, though he wished the elderly man didn't have to endure it at all. "I just need a few things, Paxton," Mr. Paul said, his voice soft, almost apologetic, as if he somehow believed he had to explain himself. He reached for a bag of rice, his hand trembling as he lifted it from the shelf. "You heard me, old man," Paxton shouted, his face growing redder with each passing second. "I don't want you in my store anymore. You've been coming here for years, and I'm tired of your uselessness. You can't even walk without that cane, and you still come here and waste my time." The venom in Paxton's words hit Marcus like a physical blow. He could feel the heat rising in his own chest, the injustice of it all making his fists clench at his sides. But Paxton's next move was even worse. With a sudden jerk of his foot, Paxton kicked Mr. Paul's cane out from under him. The sound of the cane hitting the floor echoed through the store like a gunshot, and before Marcus could even move, Mr. Paul was on the ground. The old man's fragile body crumpled onto the cold tile floor with a sickening thud, his medication scattering across the floor like confetti. For a moment, everything seemed to stop. The air seemed to freeze around them, and the only thing that moved was the dust motes swirling in the sunlight. Mr. Paul let out a soft groan, his face contorted in pain as he tried to push himself up, but his frailty made it nearly impossible. His cane lay a few feet away, and his medication was scattered in every direction, forgotten and trampled underfoot. Marcus stood frozen, his heart pounding in his chest as he watched Paxton stand over Mr. Paul, his face twisted in contempt. "Get up, old man," Paxton spat. "I didn't tell you to sit down." It was then that Marcus snapped. The weight of the moment crushed him. Every part of his being screamed at him to help Mr. Paul, to run to his side and make sure the old man was okay. But the fear that gripped him was like a vice around his chest. He had always known Paxton was cruel, but he had never seen this side of him, never seen him push someone so far, so intentionally. Without thinking, Marcus rushed to Mr. Paul's side. His hands shook as he gently helped the elderly man sit up, his voice low and comforting. "It's okay, Mr. Paul. I've got you." But before he could do anything more, Paxton's hand shot out like a whip, grabbing Marcus by the arm and yanking him away from the old man. "If you help that pathetic fool, you can kiss your job goodbye," Paxton growled, his breath hot with fury. The threat hung in the air like a storm cloud, dark and menacing. Marcus froze, his pulse hammering in his ears. For a moment, everything else disappeared, the hot air, the harsh lighting, the aching of his body. All that mattered was the threat Paxton had just issued. He couldn't lose this job. Not now. Not when his family needed him. His youngest brother, Noah, was battling leukemia. Every day was a struggle to keep him alive, and Marcus had sacrificed everything to make sure that his family had what they needed. If he lost this job, if he lost his only source of income, everything would fall apart. Yet, even as the thought swirled in his mind, he could feel something else rising within him, a deep, burning sense of injustice. He could not stand idly by and let Paxton continue to abuse Mr. Paul like this. He couldn't let the old man suffer alone. The pull to do the right thing was strong, but the cost was heavy. In that moment, Marcus was faced with a decision that would change everything. The dilemma of loyalty and survival. The tension in the store thickened like a storm cloud, ready to burst. Marcus could feel the hot breath of Mr. Paxton at his back, the hand gripping his arm like iron, dragging him away from Mr. Paul. His body tensed, the pressure of the situation escalating by the second. For a moment, everything seemed to slow down. The world outside the small grocery store, quiet, unremarkable, disappeared entirely. All that remained was the intensity of the moment, Mr. Paxton's cruel eyes locking onto Marcus's, the vulnerable, trembling figure of Mr. Paul still sitting on the cold floor, his frail body shaking as he tried to collect his scattered medication. Marcus had never been a fighter. He wasn't the kind of person who sought out conflict, but he couldn't deny the sense of injustice that burned deep within him now. He had always tried to do the right thing, at least, that's what he had told himself. His whole life had been spent making sacrifices for others, shouldering responsibilities far beyond his years. But now, in the face of Paxton's malicious threat, Marcus was torn between his sense of duty to Mr. Paul and the overwhelming fear of losing everything he had worked so hard for. "You're a fool if you think I'm going to let you stand there and help him," Paxton sneered, his grip tightening around Marcus's arm. "You've got a family to feed." A roof to keep over your head. And you think I'm just going to let you disrespect me in my own store? The words hit Marcus like a slap in the face. He had heard Paxton talk down to him before, had witnessed the man berate customers, belittle other employees, and humiliate people who were already struggling. But this was different. Paxton wasn't just threatening Marcus's job, he was threatening the foundation of everything Marcus had built since his parents passed away. He was threatening the stability of his family, the safety of his siblings, the very thing that kept Marcus moving forward every single day. But Paxton didn't see it that way. To him, Marcus was just another employee, just another cog in the machine of his small-town empire. Paxton had always made it clear that his customers were his priority. Money was the driving force behind his every decision. To him, people like Marcus didn't matter. Mr. Paul didn't matter. All that mattered was power, control, and the way things had always been. And right now, Paxton was in control. Marcus tried to pull away, his arm jerking instinctively, but Paxton's grip only tightened. His nails dug into Marcus's flesh, a reminder that no one was safe from Paxton's wrath. Marcus opened his mouth, but no words came out. The fear that had paralyzed him earlier returned with full force, swallowing him whole. He needed this job, desperately. His brother Noah's medical bills were mounting with every passing day, and every minute he spent on this job was another minute closer to securing the money for his treatment. But how could he stand by and do nothing when Mr. Paul, someone who had never done anything to deserve Paxton's cruelty, was on the floor, helpless? Marcus's eyes flickered back to Mr. Paul, whose frail form was still hunched over, trying in vain to gather his belongings. His cane lay just out of reach, and his medication was now scattered in a haphazard mess. It was as if everything in that moment had come to a standstill, the entire world locked in place by the injustice of it all. "Let him go, Paxton," Marcus finally said, his voice rough with a mixture of anger and desperation. He didn't know where the words came from, but they spilled out anyway. "You can't treat people like this." For a heartbeat, there was silence. Even Paxton seemed taken aback by Marcus's sudden defiance. His cold eyes narrowed, scrutinizing Marcus's face as if trying to gauge whether the young man was serious or just caught up in some fleeting moment of misplaced courage. "You think you can talk to me like that?" Paxton growled, his lip curling into a sneer. "You're nothing but a paycheck to me, Marcus. A tool. And if you don't watch yourself, you'll be out on the street faster than you can say goodbye." Marcus swallowed hard. The threat was clear, and it hit him like a hammer blow. He knew Paxton wasn't bluffing. The man had a history of firing people on a whim, without a second thought. If Marcus lost this job, he would lose everything. His family depended on him, and he couldn't afford to make a rash decision. But the nagging voice in his head, the voice that had always urged him to do the right thing, even when it was hard, was growing louder with each passing second. His gaze flickered again to Mr. Paul, still struggling to stand up. The old man's face was flushed with embarrassment, his eyes downcast as he clutched his cane. He had endured so much in his life already. Was Marcus really going to stand by and watch him suffer further? Was he really going to turn his back on someone who had done nothing but live quietly in the town for decades, only to be humiliated by a bully like Paxton? The decision weighed heavily on Marcus's shoulders, but as the seconds stretched into what felt like hours, the answer became clear. He couldn't turn away. He couldn't live with himself if he did nothing. Without thinking, Marcus jerked his arm out of Paxton's grasp, the adrenaline rushing through his body like a flood. He dropped to his knees beside Mr. Paul, offering him a steady hand to help him up. "It's okay, Mr. Paul. I've got you. Let me help you." Paxton's eyes blazed with fury, his face turning an even deeper shade of crimson. "You'll regret this, Marcus," he spat, his voice low and menacing. "You'll regret it when you don't have a job tomorrow. And when you can't put food on the table for your little siblings." The word stung, but Marcus didn't falter. He kept his focus on Mr. Paul, who was now standing with Marcus's assistance. The old man's hand trembled in his, but there was a glimmer of gratitude in his eyes. It wasn't much, just a small look of recognition, but it was enough to remind Marcus of why he was doing this. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Paxton stood there, seething with anger, his fists clenched at his sides. His whole body seemed to radiate rage, but Marcus didn't back down. He didn't look at Paxton, his focus was entirely on Mr. Paul, making sure the old man didn't fall again. Finally, Paxton turned on his heel and stormed out of the store, muttering curses under his breath. The bell above the door jingled as he slammed it shut behind him. The silence that followed was almost deafening, as if the store itself had exhaled a breath it had been holding for far too long. Marcus exhaled shakily, trying to steady his racing heart. It wasn't over, not by a long shot, but in that brief moment, he had made his choice. He had chosen to stand up for what was right, no matter the consequences. But as the minutes passed and the adrenaline began to wear off, reality settled in. Marcus knew Paxton's threats were not empty. The man had a way of making people's lives miserable, and if he had his way, Marcus would be out of a job by the end of the day. He couldn't afford to lose his job, not now, not with everything that was riding on it. Yet, despite the fear that gripped him, Marcus knew one thing for sure: he would never again let Paxton push anyone around in his presence. He had drawn a line in the sand, and there was no going back. Now, the only question that remained was how long he could stand up to the man who held the power to ruin his life. The cost of standing up. The minutes that followed Paxton's departure felt like a blur to Marcus. He stood frozen in place beside Mr. Paul, his hand still resting lightly on the old man's frail arm. The store, once filled with tension, now felt oddly quiet, eerily so. The whir of the ceiling fan above and the hum of the fluorescent lights felt distant, almost disconnected from the heaviness of the moment. Mr. Paul, still trembling from the ordeal, offered Marcus a small, grateful smile, though it was clear the old man was exhausted, physically and emotionally. His frail body sagged with age, and his face was lined with decades of hardship. Marcus gently guided him toward the counter, his heart heavy as he glanced around the store, half expecting Paxton to storm back through the door at any moment. I didn't mean to cause any trouble," Mr. Paul said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "No trouble at all, Mr. Paul," Marcus replied, his tone gentle but firm. He led the elderly man to the counter and started ringing up his items, his hands moving mechanically despite the emotional storm swirling inside of him. "You don't have to apologize for anything. Paxton's the one who's out of line." Mr. Paul seemed to hesitate for a moment, then gave a slight nod. "It's just. I've been coming here for years, you know," he said, his voice laced with sadness. "Never caused any problems. Never asked for much. But the way he talks to people, it just gets harder and harder to take." He paused, looking down at the items in his basket, his fingers brushing over the edges of the cans. "People like him don't understand what it's like to be at the end of your days, to have no one to lean on." Marcus couldn't bring himself to respond to that. Instead, he focused on the task at hand, the quiet beeping of the scanner filling the silence between them. He was doing his best to remain composed, but inside, a storm raged. Paxton had threatened him, humiliated him, and worst of all, he had tried to break Marcus's spirit. The truth was, Marcus was terrified. Terrified of what was to come. He had no idea how Paxton would retaliate, but he could feel the weight of the consequences pressing down on him like a vice. The bell above the door jingled again, this time softer than before. Marcus looked up, startled, but it was only a regular customer, a middle-aged woman with a basket of fresh vegetables. She offered a quick smile as she passed by, oblivious to the tension that still lingered in the air. Marcus nodded politely but didn't engage. His mind was elsewhere, his thoughts swirling with the uncertainty of the future. As he bagged Mr. Paul's items, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that Paxton was watching him from somewhere, maybe from the street outside or from his car, parked just out of sight. It felt like the storm was just beginning to gather, and soon, it would unleash its fury. After Mr. Paul had paid, Marcus watched the old man slowly make his way to the door, his cane tapping lightly against the floor as he shuffled out. Marcus smiled faintly as he waved goodbye, though he couldn't ignore the unease that gnawed at him. The last thing he wanted was for Mr. Paul to suffer any more because of him. But that wasn't something Marcus could control. He had done what he believed was right, and if Paxton had a problem with that, it was Paxton's issue, not his. The next hour dragged on painfully slow. The store was quieter than usual. No customers lingered, no chatter filled the aisles. It felt like everyone had been holding their breath ever since the confrontation, unsure of what would happen next. Marcus could hear the ticking of the clock behind the counter, each second marking the time he was still employed, each second that he still had a roof over his head, a paycheck to provide for his family. But the phone call came sooner than he had expected. It was 3:30 in the afternoon when the phone on the counter rang, its shrill ring echoing throughout the empty store. Marcus's stomach sank as he wiped his hands on his apron, his mind already racing. He didn't have to be told who it was, he knew it was Paxton. He had seen it before. Paxton had a way of manipulating people, of making them feel small, of twisting the knife in just the right place. The moment Marcus picked up the receiver, he already knew that his fate had been sealed. "Marcus," Paxton's voice came through the receiver, cold and commanding. "Get over here now. I need to speak with you." Marcus's heart hammered in his chest, but he forced himself to sound calm. "Is there a problem, Mr. Paxton?" "You know damn well what the problem is," Paxton snarled. "You made a big mistake today, boy. I'm not going to let you get away with it." The line went dead for a split second, the words hanging in the air like smoke. Marcus's throat went dry, and he felt a chill run down his spine. He knew Paxton was going to fire him. He could hear it in the man's voice, feel the anger pulsing through the receiver. Paxton was not someone who took insubordination lightly. Marcus had crossed a line, and now, he was going to pay the price. His mind raced as he tried to think of a way out of it. He couldn't afford to lose this job. Not with Noah's medical bills piling up, not with his siblings depending on him. He couldn't let Paxton have that kind of power over him. But what could he do? "You want me to come over there right now?" Marcus asked, his voice trembling despite his best efforts to keep it steady. "You're going to come over here, and we're going to have a conversation," Paxton replied, his tone dripping with venom. "But don't think for a second that I'm going to let you slide on this. You'll learn what happens when you mess with me." Marcus's hands tightened around the phone, and for a brief moment, he considered hanging up. He could just walk away. He could leave this job, leave this town, and never look back. But the thought of abandoning his siblings, the thought of Noah lying in a hospital bed, made that decision impossible. With a deep breath, Marcus hung up the phone. He felt his legs wobble beneath him as he stood up, his knees weak from the emotional roller coaster of the last few hours. He couldn't lose hope now. Not when so much was at stake. But what would Paxton do to him? And was he ready for whatever came next? The price of integrity. Marcus stepped out of the store, his hands still trembling from the phone call. The hot sun outside felt like it was burning the very air around him, the rays pressing down on him like 1,000 invisible hands. The street seemed unusually empty for the time of day, the typical hum of activity muted under the weight of uncertainty. He walked slowly toward the alley behind the store, where Paxton's beat-up old car was parked. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the ground itself were reluctant to let him move forward. His mind raced. He had never been in this position before. Sure, he had faced hardship, had dealt with difficult situations and people, but this felt different. This wasn't just about him anymore. This wasn't just a matter of fighting for survival, it was about doing the right thing in the face of a man who had the power to tear apart everything Marcus had worked for. Paxton wasn't someone who just let things slide. He was ruthless, driven by ego, and Marcus knew that if he walked into that office, things would never be the same again. Still, Marcus didn't stop walking. There was no turning back. He had already made his decision. He had made the choice to stand up for Mr. Paul, to stand up for what was right, no matter the cost. And now, it was time to face the consequences. When he reached Paxton's car, Marcus took a deep breath and squared his shoulders. He knocked on the door, the sound of his knuckles hitting the wood echoing louder than he expected. A few moments passed, and just as Marcus was about to knock again, the door swung open. Paxton stood there, glaring down at him with the same cold, menacing look that Marcus had seen 100 times before. The man's face was a twisted mask of anger and contempt, his eyes narrow slits as he surveyed Marcus from head to toe. "I was wondering when you'd show up," Paxton muttered, stepping aside to allow Marcus into the small, dimly lit office. The smell of stale coffee and old paperwork filled the air as Marcus walked in, taking in the familiar clutter that was Paxton's workspace. It was the same every time, papers scattered across the desk, a half-eaten sandwich forgotten on a napkin, and the faint odor of cigarette smoke lingering in the air. Marcus could feel the tension in the room like a living thing. He knew this conversation wasn't going to go the way he wanted, but he had to face it head-on. There was no other choice. His family needed him. His siblings needed him. And if this job was the only thing standing between them and disaster, he would fight for it, even if it meant standing up to Paxton. Paxton motioned for Marcus to sit in the chair across from his desk. Marcus did so without hesitation, his back straight and his posture tense. Paxton didn't sit, instead pacing back and forth like a predator preparing to strike. "I don't know what got into you today, Marcus," Paxton said, his voice low and dangerous. "You've been working for me for what, 2 years now? And you've never shown a lick of defiance. But today? Today you decided to take a stand for some old man who comes in here and causes nothing but problems. Do you have any idea what you've done?" Marcus stayed silent for a moment, his hands gripping the arms of the chair as he gathered his thoughts. He had anticipated Paxton's anger, but hearing it directed at him was something else entirely. Still, he couldn't let Paxton intimidate him. Not now. Not when so much was at stake. "Mr. Paxton," Marcus said quietly, his voice steady but firm. "I did what I thought was right. Mr. Paul didn't deserve what happened today. He's just an old man trying to get by, and you." Paxton cut him off with a sharp wave of his hand. "I don't need a lecture, Marcus. You think you're some kind of hero now? Standing up for the helpless? For the weak? You're just a pawn in this game, boy. A tool for me to use whenever I need you. And today, you went against me. You embarrassed me in front of my customers, you undermined my authority. And now, you think you can just walk out of this unscathed?" Marcus didn't flinch. He had been warned about this. Paxton was a man who thrived on control, on power, and the moment someone challenged that, they became a threat. Marcus knew he had crossed a line. But what else was he supposed to do? Stay silent? Watch as Paxton berated an elderly man, as he bullied someone weaker than him. No, Marcus couldn't live with that. He wouldn't. "I'm sorry for causing trouble, but I'm not going to back down," Marcus said, his voice rising slightly with conviction. "What you did to Mr. Paul was wrong. And I won't stand by and let you treat people like that." For a moment, Paxton was silent. His lips were pressed into a thin line, his jaw clenched so tight that Marcus could hear the muscles in his face strain. It was clear Paxton wasn't used to being challenged, especially by someone he considered beneath him. Marcus could see the man's fists clenching, his knuckles turning white as he tried to contain his rage. Then, Paxton spoke again, his voice cold and controlled, though tinged with an edge of fury. You really think you're in a position to lecture me? You think you can do whatever you want just because you helped some old fool? You're not irreplaceable, Marcus. I'll fire you in a heartbeat if it means I don't have to deal with your insubordination. Marcus felt his heart drop into his stomach. He had known it was coming, but hearing it spoken out loud made it all the more real. His hands tightened into fists, and his breath came faster as a wave of anxiety and fear crashed over him. But even with the fear clawing at his chest, Marcus knew one thing: he couldn't back down now. Not after everything. If you're going to fire me, then fire me, Marcus said, his voice low but unwavering. But I won't apologize for doing what's right. If standing up to you costs me my job, then so be it. But I'm not going to let you get away with treating people like that. Paxton's eyes blazed with fury, his nostrils flaring as he took a step toward Marcus. You think you're some kind of martyr? You think you're better than me? I'm not going to let you ruin everything I've worked for, Marcus. You're done here. Get out of my sight. Now. The words hit Marcus like a physical blow, but he didn't let it show. He stood up slowly, his legs unsteady but his resolve stronger than ever. He had made his choice. The consequences were inevitable, but at least he could leave this place with his integrity intact. As he turned to walk out of the office, he heard Paxton's voice one last time, low and venomous. You'll regret this, Marcus. You'll regret crossing me. Marcus didn't respond. He simply walked out, his heart pounding in his chest. The door slammed behind him with a finality that echoed in his mind. He had done it. He had stood up for what was right. But now, as the weight of the reality settled in, he couldn't help but wonder if he had just lost everything. The struggle for survival. Marcus stood in the parking lot outside Paxton's store, the harsh sunlight reflecting off his car windows, casting long shadows over the cracked asphalt. His breath came in shallow, uneven gasps as he tried to steady himself, his hands still trembling from the confrontation. The reality of what had just happened was beginning to sink in, but even as his mind raced through 1,000 thoughts, one question echoed louder than the rest: what now? He had been fired. The steady paycheck that had kept him going for years, that had supported his family, was now gone. Just like that. It wasn't that he hadn't known the risk. Deep down, he'd known standing up to Paxton could cost him his job. But somehow, the finality of it still hit like a blow to the chest. With the weight of the world pressing down on him, Marcus slowly made his way to his car, his mind flickering back to the moment when Paxton had thrown him out of the office. It wasn't just about the job anymore. It was about survival. His heart tightened as he thought of his younger siblings, especially Noah, who was still in the hospital, fighting for his life against leukemia. The medical bills were astronomical, and without Marcus's income, there was no telling how they'd manage to pay for his treatment. He hadn't been able to afford much, but at least the job had kept them afloat. And now, without it, everything seemed to be unraveling at once. The small thread that held their world together had snapped, and Marcus had no idea how he would pick up the pieces. Marcus got into his car, slamming the door behind him as though shutting out the weight of the world. His fingers hovered over the steering wheel for a moment before he started the engine. The familiar hum of the engine was oddly soothing, but the comfort was fleeting. There was no ignoring the pit in his stomach. His mind drifted back to the days when he had first come to the city, full of hope and ambition, ready to make something of himself. He had dreamed of finishing college, of breaking free from the cycle of poverty that had defined his early years. But life had other plans. The sudden death of their parents had forced him into a role he hadn't asked for, the role of protector and provider for his siblings. He had sacrificed everything, his education, his youth, his own dreams, to make sure they had a chance at a better life. Now, all of that was on the line. Marcus pulled into the parking lot of the apartment complex where he and his siblings lived. It was a modest place, nothing fancy, but it was home. As he stepped out of the car, the familiar scent of laundry detergent and fried food wafted through the air, mingling with the sound of children playing in the courtyard. He paused for a moment, watching them as they ran around, laughing without a care in the world. For a brief second, he envied their innocence, their ability to find joy in the simplest of things. But he couldn't afford to think about that right now. He had to be the strong one. He had to be the one who held everything together. Marcus! A voice called out, and Marcus turned to see his youngest sister, Layla, running toward him. She was 8 years old, with wide eyes and a mischievous smile that reminded him so much of their mother. Layla had always been the happiest of the bunch, the one who never seemed to worry about anything. But even now, Marcus saw a flicker of concern in her expression. "Hey, Layla," he said, kneeling down to her level as she reached him. "How was school today?" "Good," she said, her eyes lighting up as she jumped up and down. "We did a science experiment. But Mama said you'd be home early today. Is everything okay?" Marcus's heart sank. Layla was too young to understand the weight of what had just happened, but she could sense something was wrong. She always could. "Everything's fine," Marcus said quickly, though the lie tasted bitter on his tongue. "Just had a long day, that's all." She tilted her head, clearly unconvinced, but she didn't press the matter further. "Okay," she said, then brightened again. "Are we having spaghetti for dinner tonight?" "Sure, we can have spaghetti," Marcus replied, giving her a reassuring smile. "Let me just grab some stuff, and I'll start cooking." As Layla ran off to join the others, Marcus stood there for a moment, feeling the weight of his responsibilities settle in again. The house was silent, but there was a sense of tension in the air. His siblings were depending on him, and he could sense their unspoken worries, even if they didn't say anything aloud. They knew that things were hard. They knew money was tight. And now, with the loss of his job, that pressure was going to get even worse. Marcus spent the next few hours pretending like everything was normal. He cooked dinner, played board games with the younger kids, and tried to push aside the growing panic in his chest. But deep down, he knew the truth. He couldn't keep up the facade forever. Something had to change, and soon. That evening, as he lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, Marcus tried to think of a way out of this. He thought of every job opening he could apply to, every opportunity that might be available. But the reality was, he didn't have the luxury of time. Noah's treatment wasn't going to wait. The bills weren't going to magically disappear. The weight of his family's survival rested squarely on his shoulders, and right now, he felt completely alone. Just as he was about to drift off to sleep, his phone buzzed on the nightstand. He reached for it, his heart skipping a beat when he saw the message. It was from one of his former co-workers, Carla. "Marcus, I heard what happened. I know things are tough right now, but if you need help, let me know. I know a guy who might have a job opening. It's not much, but it's something. Hang in there." For a moment, Marcus just stared at the screen, the weight of Carla's words sinking in. It wasn't much, but it was a glimmer of hope. The idea of getting another job, no matter how small, felt like a lifeline thrown to him in a sea of uncertainty. He couldn't afford to let it slip away. He quickly typed a response, his fingers shaking slightly. "Thank you, Carla. I really appreciate it. Can you give me more details about the job?" As he hit send, a sense of calm washed over him, if only for a moment. He had a small spark of hope now, a chance to rebuild. It wasn't going to be easy. It wasn't going to be immediate. But it was something. And sometimes, in the darkest of times, something was all you needed to keep going. The turning point. The following days passed in a blur of uncertainty. Marcus woke up each morning with a heavy heart, his mind still consumed by the weight of his recent firing. As much as he tried to pretend that everything was fine for the sake of his younger siblings, the reality gnawed at him relentlessly. Every time he saw his little sister Layla's hopeful face or heard Noah's weak voice over the phone, asking when he would be coming to visit him in the hospital again, Marcus felt the painful sting of failure. He had promised them that everything would be okay, that he would always provide for them, no matter what. But now, without a job, without a steady income, he didn't know how he could keep that promise. That glimmer of hope, the message from Carla about the job opportunity, was the only thing keeping him going. It wasn't much, but it was something. Something that, if it worked out, could be the difference between his family surviving this storm or being swept under by it. He had no idea what kind of job it was. Carla hadn't given him any details yet, but he had learned to trust her over the years. She was a good person, someone who had always looked out for him, even when Paxton and the others turned their backs on him. Marcus had spent the past few days sending out resumes, applying for any job that seemed even remotely promising. He had scoured every job board he could find, calling in favors and asking anyone he knew if they had any openings. But with each passing day, it became more apparent that the options were limited. The economy was tough, and opportunities were scarce. Most of the positions he applied for were either already filled or required qualifications he didn't have. Still, he didn't give up. He couldn't. Not when there was so much riding on his shoulders. On the third day after receiving Carla's message, Marcus received another text from her. "Marcus, I got the details for that job. It's a warehouse position, nothing glamorous, but the pay is decent. It's night shifts, so you'll have some flexibility during the day. The catch is, it's only temporary, but it could lead to something permanent if you prove yourself. I can give you the contact information for the manager. I'll leave it up to you." For the first time in what felt like forever, Marcus felt a spark of hope. A warehouse job wasn't his ideal, but he didn't have the luxury of being picky. He needed a paycheck. He needed something to hold on to. And if it was temporary, well, at least it was something to buy him some time until he could find something better. Marcus didn't hesitate. He immediately texted Carla back, thanking her and asking for the contact information. Then, he called the number she provided, his nerves flaring with each ring. When a gruff voice on the other end finally picked up, Marcus took a deep breath, trying to steady his racing heart. "Hello? Is this the manager of the warehouse?" he asked. "Yeah, who's asking?" The voice sounded bored, uninterested. "My name is Marcus, and I'm calling about the job you have available. Carla gave me your number. She said you might be looking for someone to start immediately." There was a pause on the other end of the line, followed by a soft sigh. "We are looking for someone. But let me be clear, it's hard work. You'll be on your feet all night, loading and unloading trucks. The work isn't easy, and it's not for everyone. You sure you want to take this on?" Marcus's grip tightened around the phone. He didn't have a choice. "I'm sure. I can handle it. All right, come in tomorrow night at 10 p.m. sharp. We'll see if you're cut out for it." "Thank you. I'll be there," Marcus said, his voice steady with determination, despite the nervous flutter in his stomach. He hung up the phone and sat there for a moment, staring at the wall in front of him. His hands shook slightly, but his mind was clear. This was his chance to prove that he could keep his family together, that he could get through this, no matter how hard it was. That night, after a quick dinner with his siblings, Marcus got into his car and drove to the warehouse. The streets were quieter than usual, and the cool night air carried a sense of stillness that matched his nerves. He had never worked a night shift before, never worked in a warehouse, but he knew he had to do this. For Noah. For Layla. For all of them. When Marcus arrived at the warehouse, it looked even larger and more imposing than he had imagined. The building was dark, with only a few lights flickering above the loading dock. A group of workers were standing outside, talking amongst themselves, their voices low and indistinct in the night. They stopped talking when they saw Marcus approach, sizing him up with a quick glance. He wasn't sure if it was the nervous energy he was giving off or just their routine, but the feeling of being an outsider, of not belonging, hit him immediately. He swallowed the lump in his throat and walked up to the door, where the manager was waiting for him. The man, a middle-aged guy with a scruffy beard and a permanent scowl, motioned for Marcus to follow him inside. "You ready to get started?" the manager asked, his tone flat. Marcus nodded. "Yeah, I'm ready." The manager led him through the dimly lit warehouse, past rows of stacked pallets and shelves full of boxes. The air inside smelled of cardboard and dust, the only sound the hum of the overhead lights. The space felt vast, almost suffocating, and Marcus's steps echoed loudly as he walked. For the next few hours, Marcus worked tirelessly, learning the ropes of loading and unloading trucks, stacking boxes, and sorting shipments. It was grueling, physically demanding work, and his body ached from the effort. His hands were raw from lifting and moving heavy packages, and his legs felt like lead. But through it all, he kept his focus. He had no choice. By the time his shift ended, Marcus was exhausted. His muscles were sore, and his mind was foggy from the exhaustion. But as he left the warehouse that night, a strange feeling of satisfaction washed over him. He had made it through the night. He had proven that he was capable of handling the job. And, perhaps more importantly, he had taken the first step toward rebuilding his life, toward ensuring that his family would be okay. The manager had told him to come back the next night, which was a good sign. It meant they thought he had potential. As Marcus drove home, the quiet hum of the engine seemed to carry a sense of quiet optimism with it. It wasn't much, but it was something. And for the first time in days, Marcus allowed himself a small, hopeful smile.